My name is Richard Parks. I'm the Executive Director of the Sol Price Center for Social Innovation. And really, it's my honor today to welcome and introduce our guest speaker. He is the Henry Ford II Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University, where he has served as the chair of the Sociology Department. Prior to moving to Harvard in 2003, he taught at the University of Chicago for 12 years. While there, he served as the scientific director of the landmark Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods, a longitudinal study of 6,000 randomly selected children, adolescents, and young adults that examine the changing circumstances of their lives and the personal characteristics that might lead them toward or away from a variety of antisocial behaviors. It is this research that has significantly informed his extraordinary book, Great American City, Chicago and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect. William Julius Wilson has written that Great American City is one of the most comprehensive and sophisticated empirical studies ever conducted by a social scientist. It will not only change the way we think about neighborhood effects, it also sets a new standard for social scientific inquiry. Today, we're delighted for an opportunity to welcome him to USC, to sunny Southern California from what has been a very cold winter on the East Coast, and to consider together the implications of his work for revitalizing low-income urban communities. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rob Sampson.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and yes, thank you for the sun and the warmth. All of us on the East Coast are suicidal, as you may know from your friends. It's been brutal, even for the hardcore among us. So it's great to be here and share with you a little bit some of my work. As Richard noted, the title of the talk, actually in the cover of the book, is up here, Great American City, Chicago and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect. What I'd like to do is to talk with you a little bit today about some of the research behind the book, but also to take it a little bit beyond that and talk briefly about some of the research that I'm currently involved with that builds off of the work. And there's 3 specific projects actually that are ongoing, actually a few more, but I'll just talk about 3, give you a flavor for where the research is going, but also hopefully to give you a grounding in the existing research that exists in the book. And in a way, the thesis is on the cover, sort of, in the sense that I argue that neighborhoods, ecological subsections of cities with social distinctiveness exist in many, if not all, cities. That is to say, there's a great deal of diversity across ecological areas in cities. You see a colorful mosaic here. Unfortunately, the pointer works everywhere except the laser screen. It's a modern technology. But you can see here that Chicago is made up of many diverse neighborhoods. And I argue that they're important. They are manifested in a number of different social phenomena, some which we often don't put together. It's not just poverty, it's not just crime. It's a number of things, as I will show. And also that neighborhoods are surprisingly persistent over time, hence the idea of the enduring neighborhood effect. Now, this goes against the grain of a lot of current thinking, of course, because there's a sense that the world is flat, as Thomas Friedman has told us, and it may well be with regard to economic flows and trade. But when it comes to residential differentiation, it's not flat at all. It's very spiky, spiky throughout the world, I think I would add. And even with electronic communications, everyone texting and so forth, still there's this differentiation. And what I do in the book is I really try to tackle this topic, just go for it. And I confess, it's 550 pages, so no, don't let that deter you. It's wonderfully cheap, it's only $20. But it's long and it's dense, and I can't talk about all the research in 45 minutes or an hour. So this is going to be a kind of high, 30,000 foot level view. I actually started in the book in the Loop area of Chicago, which many of you have probably been to. O'Hare's up kind of in the left northwest corner, and take the reader on a walk down the streets of Chicago and show the differentiation of the different neighborhoods. And you can imagine doing that actually in any city. You could do it as I was not walking in LA, driving, of course, from the hotel down here, noticing the differentiation changes in neighborhoods. And then zoom out to take the 30,000-foot, literally aerial view. And I thought I'd start with that just to show you, first of all, the phenomenon of concentration. Now, I'm not sure how, it's probably not going to be easy to see in the back some of the fine-grained differences here. But the big picture. So first of all, homicide. Stars proportional to number of population. This is about 3 years of data, 4,000 homicides geocoded to a specific address. And what you can see is that certain neighborhoods with the larger stars have very high concentrations of violence, and it's very differentiated. For example, in the north side of the city, you almost barely can see the stars. You have entire swaths of the city, actually, that are almost homicide-free, whereas you have pockets in the west side and south side. But also note, if you can see it, that this corresponds actually to a phenomenon that's quite different than, let's say, two males in a fight, one kills another, common scene in violence, and that is child health, defined as low birth weight and infant mortality. And where child health is poor, homicide is high. And you might think, well, that's just a poverty phenomenon. They're related, but if you control for poverty, this relationship still holds. Furthermore, there is research showing that exposure to violence among children leads to a number of negative outcomes in terms of schooling and others. So this is, I think, an important phenomenon that these things go together. The light areas here are the low child health. Now, it's not just the bad stuff, right? Violence, poor health. Matters where you have a heart attack or lose a letter. Now, this was a fun part. Well, actually, the whole thing was fun, but this was particularly fun part of the study. One piece was what's called the lost letter drop. It was a variation on Stanley Milgram's experiment, for those of you who took psychology and remember that. But what we did is a variant on it addressed to fictitious addresses that actually got to a post office box. And we did a very elaborate sort of field experiment where we randomly dropped the letters, different corners and so forth, over 3,000, 3,300, I believe it was, across our sampled neighborhoods, recorded the time of day, whether it was rain and windy, this type of structure of housing and so forth. Bottom line, you take everything into account. It turns out that the rate of returning a letter varies from 0% in some neighborhoods to over 82% in others. Like, why would that be, actually, right? I mean, there's some cost. It takes a little bit of time, I suppose, to pick up a letter. But there's a great deal of variability, and it doesn't conform necessarily to our stereotypes. So, for example, some of the areas in the northeast side are very heterogeneous, right? Not your sort of related to the Bob Putnam hypothesis in the sense that very ethnically diverse neighborhoods, in fact, have some very high letter return rates. And what was more interesting, perhaps, to me is we were able to link it to a study by Nicholas Christakis in 1988 that looked at emergency CPR on the street. That is, people have a heart attack on the street, and you have random strangers giving CPR. And once you control for the age, race, sex of the victim of the heart attack, in public, it turns out that CPR rates vary too, and CPR predicts lost letter rate return 14 years later. It's kind of interesting. What does it suggest? It suggests to me that there's something about the character of that neighborhood. This is, again, different than homicide. That's point one, concentration, multiple different phenomena. Point two, persistence. Not perfect, but stability and change. I was impressed by the change. Now, if you can't see this, this is a simplest thing you can do in social science, right? A scatter plot. But it's 40 years difference. Poverty 1960, poverty in 2000. You all know what happened over that time period. I mean, tremendous change in cities. The 60s, the 70s, the collapse of cities, out-migration, racial change, economic boom, economic collapse. Yet, the highest poverty neighborhood in the 60s, the highest poverty neighborhood in 2000. The nice neighborhoods are the nice neighborhoods, right? Beverly Hills is Beverly Hills. I mean, you can name the city, the old coast of Chicago, the Upper East Side of Manhattan. There's a stickiness to neighborhoods. Not to say there's no change. There are changes here. These are gentrifying neighborhoods, right? Because these are neighborhoods that are doing better than expected. I'll get to gentrification in a minute. Gentrification is itself structured. Thirdly, other phenomena that are persistent. Concentrated incarceration. You know probably that incarceration went up a great deal, but the line of prediction from 1990 to 95 to 2000 to 2005 is 0.98. That is, the mass incarceration of the state is being imposed differentially on specific communities. It's by no means, in fact, I think mass incarceration is the wrong conceptual frame. Others have argued that as well. First of all, these areas are predominantly black neighborhoods. These are predominantly white neighborhoods. There's no overlap in this distribution whatsoever. And the rates at the low end are almost zero. And in fact, the highest, I'll just give you a simple statistic. If you take the predominantly white community that has the highest rate of incarceration in Chicago, take predominantly black neighborhood that has the highest rate, 40-fold difference. Not double, not triple, 40 times higher. That's clearing predominantly white community in the west side and East Garfield Park. These are huge differences of kind, not degree. And then finally, the legacies of the inequality are impressive too, I think. This is a map of Chicago, and those of you who maybe teach this to your students, in the Black Metropolis, which was written in 1945, talked about the original Black Belt and Grand Boulevard and so forth. And these are areas that were segregated, all black neighborhoods. But what you can see is that as you go through over time, that is, it's coded as of 1960, but the increases in poverty over 40 years, where you get a star, you have increase in poverty, are following the expansion of the Black Belt down south of the city and west. And you can see the north part of the city still well off. And notice the recent foreclosure hotspots are just simply overlaid on disadvantage. Okay, quickly. It's not just a Chicago story, I will argue. We can talk about this more in the discussion, and you can bring up LA. This is a little chart I did looking at the phenomenon of Manhattan, Queens, the boroughs of New York, essentially, and current poverty coded such that the yellow is low and the darkest color is above 31%. I won't get into why I coded it that way, but that's considered high poverty. And what you can see is those neighborhoods are very much related to the neighborhoods that have a black dot, which are those that also had high poverty in 1995, right, about 15 years later. So in other words, again, you have this phenomenon. Even though, how many watch Girls? I don't actually, but I've been told this is gentrification and everyone's talking about that. And it's true, Brooklyn is changing, and you can see that here. But the problem with that is that, including the TV show, is selecting on change, right? Rather than looking at what's happening in the structure. It's boring to do a show at Staten Island because nothing's happening. But that's what's happening, which is not much. And across the nation, the correlation during the decade of the 90s when welfare was changed in the Clinton administration, the correlation in Chicago at the neighborhood level was 0.85, and in the country was 0.85 as well. Okay, that's quick overview of this big structure. I want to read to you a quote by an archaeologist, which I found quite interesting, who has done research on ancient cities. This is Michael Smith at Arizona, and he says, based on excavations and other research, that the spatial division of cities into districts or neighborhoods is one of the few universals of urban life from the earliest cities to the present. It's a really interesting idea. In other words, it's very general, the notion of division. And it can be relative. It can be on anything. I mean, status, ethnicity, religion. And for those of you who can't see, this is Chinese city in 1080 and Yoruba in the 19th century. So, three phenomena then, just to sum up, as a sort of principles of investigation. One is the idea of concentration. The second is it's not just one thing. Think of it this way. I guess the principle I would say is inequality is concentrated, inequality is multidimensional. I think we miss the multidimensional piece a lot, right? Because we try to focus on one thing, let's just improve this, and not that, or let's experiment on this. It's multidimensional, correlated adversities are crucial. And thirdly, and this is a bit of a paradox, persistence despite change. Neighborhoods, organizations are constantly changing. People are moving in and out. But the reproduction of the social status or the social reality is an interesting question, and that's one of the things I've grappled with. So the research in the book and my sort of intellectual trajectory have been, well, I guess you could say, obsessed with two things. One is to try to get at these social mechanisms and processes, kind of get beyond just the composition of the population. And secondly, a methodological theme has been that much of social science has been reductionist, looking at individual characteristics. We can learn from that. There's a very precise methodology, psychometrics, that's been proposed and is successful, where we have some consensus about how to measure and examine individual differences. My colleagues and I have argued we need this for ecology, hence econometrics, a metric for the study of social ecology. All right, so let me now zoom through a couple examples and give you a flavor for the study. So the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. Big study, collaborative, involved a lot of people. I can't get into everything right now. Started in a study group in the early 90s. Data collection began roughly 1995 with a longitudinal study of 6,200 children. So just remember this for a second, because I'm going to come back to it later in a follow-up. It's a sequential age cohort design, or accelerated longitudinal design for you developmentalists. What that means is different cohorts studied through the same secular period of time. It was a birth cohort. Women were enrolled when they were pregnant. So 0, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, and 18-year-olds followed out for about 7 years. Secondly, a separate study of the neighborhoods themselves in which the kids were living. And this is what the design looked like. It's a random, multi-stage stratified sample. So if this is representative of kids growing up in Chicago at the time. These are different neighborhood clusters, and they were stratified by race, ethnicity. I won't get into the details. And socioeconomic status. So we wanted to make sure this is not a study of, quote, the ghetto. This is not a study of just one group, which dominates actually a lot of social science. It gets the full spread, including heterogeneous areas, Black, Latino areas, and so on and so forth, and we can wait to represent the population. 80 clusters were chosen, and then the 6,200 kids were randomly sampled within the clusters by age. Okay, so a little bit of research design, but I had to get that out. At the neighborhood level, the econometric strategies involved community surveys of residents. Quickly, we did repeated cross-sectional surveys, all of Chicago, not just these neighborhoods, all of Chicago, about 8,200 people in 1995 and another 3,500 in 2002. Secondly, systematic social observation. We drove very slowly down the streets in an SUV with cameras taking film of the sides of the streets, in addition to 2 observers taking notes and an audio. It was an early version of Google Street View, and this was 95. I'm sorry that I didn't get any commission or anything from Google Street View. They stole this idea from us, I have to say.
Edward Shea did it before you.
Yeah, well, I'm using Google Street View, but I'll get back to that. So this is the idea of systematic social observation. The notion that it's important what people say, but we need to observe scientifically what the environment can tell us. Thirdly, networks among organizations and elites. I'll show you that in a minute. And coding of collective action events, which I will not talk about today. So I'm going to skim over 3 kind of findings from the book. Again, at a kind of high level, in the sense of not going to penetrate down and give you like specific numbers that are in terms of point estimates. But one is the idea of community processes. And one of the processes that we were quite interested in had to do with social cohesion and shared expectations in the community, what we called collective efficacy. And we asked neighbors in the study, would neighbors take action if children were skipping school, for example, fight in the neighborhood, tried to close down the fire station? How much residents trust their neighbors? How much people were active, like out here? And I don't think they're protesting, though. That's not my sense of students these days. They're got to be sports, right? It turns out that there's tremendous variation across neighborhoods in the sense that people are sharing a certain expectation about social control and trust. And part of this is a theory, really, of how collective efficacy in the modern world is related to aspects like violence and disorder and health. But it's not that it's just abstracted out of thin air. The argument is that certain structural features like the concentration of disadvantage, the residential instability of neighborhoods, network ties are important insofar as they're working through variabilities in collective efficacy, and that there is a reciprocal relationship between violence and disorder. Violence can undermine the collective efficacy of residents. And in the book, we try to get at these sorts of reciprocal relationships. And also the fact that individual characteristics are important, so-called selection bias, which I'm not going to get into in great detail, and spatial or macro level effects. This will give you a feel for it. Let me go back to that map of homicides now, go down to the actual individual homicides, and you can see here that they're very highly clustered. And the high collective efficacy neighborhoods that are in purple, dark purple, have relatively few. And we go on to then say, okay, what about poverty? What about race? What about other characteristics? And in a systematic way, look at not only differences across community, but within neighborhood changes. And it turns out, and this is based on a very complicated analysis, I'll just mention it, you can read more about it in the book, to get at the idea of a fixed effect or change, which is to say, when you look at neighborhoods and their change over time, you probably know that the crime rate has been coming down in most cities. The homicide rate was coming down in Chicago, but the shape or the slope is a function in part of the neighborhood characteristics, such that the neighborhoods with the sharpest decline in homicide are those that saw decreases in poverty, concentration of poverty, and increases in collective efficacy. So you see this dual operation, if you will, of the structural features of concentration of poverty, improvement in the neighborhood, and increases in collective efficacy related to a sharp decline. And this blue line is almost a flat line, which, as you could probably probably can't read it, but my guess is declines in efficacy and increases in poverty. And then you can see the effects of both. So changes as well are related to changes in homicide. Moreover, it's not just the Chicago effect. This was an interesting side study, which was an analysis of the relationship between collective efficacy and homicide, or violence, really. There's not much homicide in Stockholm. It just blows your mind, actually, when you do. I was working with my colleague, and he says, do you know that from 1952 to 2000, there was more homicides in Chicago in 1 year than like 50 years in Stockholm? And it's kind of embarrassing when you're working with somebody that says, yes, I come from a violent country. Don't blame me. And what you can see here is that Stockholm is below, they're in red, below the blue dots, which are Chicago neighborhoods, across the board. So in other words, yes, Chicago is ranked with violence. So there's a city national effect, if you will. But the slope, or the nature of the relationship between collective efficacy, the predictive relationship, is the same in both cities, which is an interesting phenomenon. It's kind of telling us that there's a kind of a state effect, if you will, that goes beyond anything that's going on in the neighborhood. So I'm not arguing here, by the way, and the book does not argue that the neighborhood is everything. It's an important feature, but there are certainly state features. And by the way, the state features are affecting the distribution of neighborhood inequality. I don't have it here, but in the book there's a map that shows the distribution of concentrated poverty defined the same way in Stockholm and Chicago. And we don't have a whiteboard here, but if you draw it out, you draw out sort of poverty going this way. Chicago just keeps going out there, and Stockholm stops. In other words, there are no neighborhoods in Stockholm after a certain point that have high concentrated poverty, and Chicago just keeps going. And at the other end, you see all these neighborhoods that have a lot of rich people, and only rich people, and they don't see that in Stockholm either. In other words, that's the, Brentwoods and Gold Coast and the Upper East Sides. That kind of concentration of wealth doesn't exist either. So both ends of the continuum. Now that's not a neighborhood effect, and you see it in a neighborhood effect, but it's reflected in national policies. Anyway, just wanted to make that point. Okay, that's collective efficacy. Example 2 is disorder, and I've done a lot of work here, and I've been very interested in this phenomenon. Probably everyone here has heard of the so-called broken windows theory, the idea that one broken window leads to another. Cues of disorder, such as graffiti, import offenders, that is to say, the notion is that there's a signal that this space, like this space perhaps, is ripe for being victimized. So when I teach this, I show my students, and I ask them, is this disorder? And it's interesting because you get lots of different reactions, right? No, yes. Yeah, look here. It's kind of nice. Art, maybe public art. That's not graffiti. It's subjective, they say. And I think that's right. On the other hand, you see the defacement of public property. Maybe that's a gangster disciples sign, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that whether or not this is disorder varies a lot, depending on where the neighborhood is located, the social position of the person. So for example, if you look at race ethnic differences, whites perceive more disorder than do Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, every other group. That is, even living in the exact same context. So living in this neighborhood, people would view this differently. And when you look at it across neighborhood and you then compare it to, let's say, what we can actually observe, objective disorder, the perceptions are wildly at variance, and therefore I think this has a lot to do with our interpretation of broken windows theory. By the way, as a quick aside, the broken windows theory I think never really came to grips with the fundamental fact of the original Zimbardo experiment, which somebody, or maybe people here remember, which is where Zimbardo was a brilliant experiment. He took a car, jacked it up, and made it look abandoned in the South Bronx in 1969, and did another one in Palo Alto, California, right? Well, in the Bronx, and they kind of hid and observed it, and in the Bronx, within seconds, the car was ravaged. Like 22 different people came, pulling out the engines, parts, wheels, smashing windows. You know, like an hour later, it's just the Hulk, just gone. So, you know, this is this idea that, yeah, abandonment leads to decay. But what people, I think, failed to realize was in Palo Alto, well, if anyone's been to Palo Alto, you won't be surprised. Nothing happened, because nothing happens in Palo Alto, right? It's boring, it's, you know, it's a sedate, suburban environment. The car sat there for like a week, and then I think Zimbardo got annoyed and actually had, or at one point, someone came and lowered the hood when it was raining, so the engine wouldn't get well, it's a true story. And then Zimbardo finally started smashing the windows himself. So, what does that tell you? Well, it tells me that it depends on the context, right? The expectations of what an abandoned car means in Palo Alto is very different than the Bronx. Okay. Perceptions are deceiving. Immigration in the concentration of minority groups is very highly related to the perception of disorder, but it doesn't align neatly with our examination of the objective measurement of disorder. And in fact, in Chicago, and this has now been replicated in multiple cities, and also change analysis at the national level, that immigration is actually related to lower violence. But people think the exact opposite. Okay. Finding 2. Oops. Okay, third level. So that's collective efficacy, disorder, there's a couple chapters in the book. And then there's a section on interlocking structures. What's that? Jargon? Yeah. But the notion that, again, this is not just about neighborhood, it's about a higher level of structures. And again, going beyond the neighborhood. And this is a simple graph, a lot of work behind it. But what it shows is the following. Each dot here, node, is one of our neighborhoods, and a line represents someone moving from one neighborhood to another. In other words, this is migration flows. And we can think of migration as people like Doug Massey, international scholars, have long thought of it, right? That migration is a network. People move to other countries, they move back, there's actually exchange, there's a flow, there's a structure. Well, but that's true of neighborhoods. I said they're always changing. In fact, this is just over 6 years of our data, and then you want to think back of those persistence charts. So there's something interesting going on where you have continual flows, lots of flows. So one of the things we did is to conceptualize the city as a network. and analyze then the flows between these neighborhoods as a network with the node being the neighborhood, not the individual. You won't be able to read this, so I think I'm going to skip over it quickly. But what this is an analysis that uses as the unit the tie between neighborhoods, for those of you familiar with network analysis. So in other words, it's migration, and the unit is the tie or the flow, the number of people moving between neighborhoods as a function of characteristics and dissimilarity in neighborhood characteristics, and in this land and time of where we can be anybody, where we can be anywhere, spatial distance is the biggest predictor. It's not terribly surprising. Lincoln Quillian, who's a sociologist at Northwestern, just did an analysis on the National Panel Study of Income Dynamics on a neighborhood choice analysis, found the exact same thing. Spatial distance is one of the biggest predictors of neighborhood moving. You don't move far. And then similarity in income and race, not too surprising. But what was surprising is that the crime rate, perceived disorder, civic participation, dissimilarity was a great predictor. That is to say, the greater the dissimilarity, the less there was a tie between those two neighborhoods. And I have a theoretical account for that in the book. Another higher order structure is the key informant study, and I want to mention that for a minute. This is what networks usually look like at the individual level. These are all the players in Chicago. We sampled positions, so politicians, law enforcement, religion, education, community organization leaders, so for example, the priests, the precinct captains, real estate officials, politicians, and then the person in the middle, Mr. Big, you can guess who that might be. And these are positioned in terms of centrality, and also you can see that there are people ringed around the circle. These are people that have no contacts. That's important because those are structural isolates. These are people that have no ties to others, which is quite important when you're thinking of the ability to get things done for a community. Now, what I'd like you to imagine now is that, okay, this is what it looks like at the community level, but to think what is missing here. And I think what's missing in a lot of the network research is the structural community piece behind it. Because when we take this and we break it down, what we see are tremendous variations like this. In other words, and this is a real community. This is South Shore. Someone mentioned to me earlier, we were talking about Harvey Malich's work on South Shore. And I've been having this ongoing conversation with another scholar about South Shore. And he was saying, you know what, that's exactly what it's like. 3 cliques and a lot of isolates. All right? These are people that don't have connections in any of these little cliques. And this may have a lot to do with how South Shore does or does not do so well. This is another community which is basically a spider web of dense connections with only 3 isolates, Hegwish. This varies across communities, and in the book I look at the relationship between the network structure of the communities and various outcomes, controlling for poverty and other things, and there does seem to be a difference. That is to say, how leaders are connected matters. And finally, we can go to the pure aerial perspective. This is the entire city now, where the communities are the nodes and the ties, again, are between them, but also you can think about how communities are, in a sense, mediators or brokers, so that some communities, like Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago is tying in communities on the south side or near north side and loop, and conducting analysis in terms of how this sort of higher order structure is important in understanding a city in a metropolitan area. So you can see that the work is trying to have a conversation between how individuals move or make decisions, sort of a schematic, not that I think in purely mechanistic terms, but as an analogy to the idea that individuals are constantly making choices. They do have autonomy, making choices, but always within the context of structures and neighborhoods. And when you make a choice, when I move from one community to another, just like on that chart, I by definition change the community I left behind, because I'm no longer there. and I'm changing the community I move to. And depending on the flow, it's going to make a difference or not. But I'm choosing based on the compositions of the neighborhood. So the neighborhood's affecting my choice, but my choice is affecting the neighborhood, and so on and so forth. So it really is a complex higher order structure, but it's an interesting one, and I think undermines some of the more simplistic reductionist tendencies in the social sciences, including by sociologists, by the way, which is sometimes all top-down structure, and at the other end, pure individual choice models, which I think are not necessarily the way we want to go. So I don't want to just talk about the book. I have a little time, right? Okay, good. I want to maybe motivate some new stuff and get you thinking. I don't have the answers to all this, but there's something going on, and you see it in LA and all cities. Cities are changing. So there was, in my era, Bill Wilson, the truly disadvantaged. I sort of came of age intellectually studying cities in the era of gloom and doom, right? The outmigration, the cities were falling apart. But think about what's happening today. Suburbanization of poverty. Inner city poverty is no longer the norm. We have an historic crime decline. I want to try to convince you that this is massive. It's huge, and I think it's one of the biggest social transformations in the last 50 years, actually, just to be provocative. Gentrification. Huge changes in gentrification and a public housing revolution, particularly in cities like Chicago. Immigration boom, another major structural change in the United States. For example, from 1990 to 2000, the rate of foreign-born increased 50%. I mean, we're talking huge structural changes. And finally, of course, the Great Recession, which then hit during all these changes. So it's like, buffeted by these macro forces. Now, I don't know if anyone can see this. I love this picture because I lived in New York in the 1970s. And this is what it looks like. Anyone live there? Yeah, right. You recognize this, right? Yeah, at the dog, huh? The subways covered in graffiti, fear and loathing, perhaps, the cops. There was a real sense of foreboding. I love this picture, too. There was our president, Gerald Ford. In addition to bumbling about, he did, or allegedly declared to New York to drop dead during the fiscal crisis. This is a 1975 headline. And this is a picture of the Bronx. Talk about broken windows. Howard Cosell was alleged to have said the Bronx is burning. This has actually never been, I think, completely. This was during a Yankees game, I think it was. Of course, the Yankee Stadium is in the Bronx. But anyway, this was sort of the essence of the city at the time. But if you think about the differences, so you just do a little bit of math and you play out the rate of crime, it turns out that number of people alive today that would not otherwise have been, had that rate persisted at 1992, 100,000. 100,000 people alive. That's a huge difference. The rate of violence is incredible. Magnitude, New York, 85% decline. Here in LA, 75% decline. New York is now at the rate it was in the 1950s, before the increase in the 60s. Toronto is at a 40-year low. Well, to get into another whole debate, but I won't, just to mention, Japan is down, Estonia is down, Western Europe is down. So, right, the fact that it was all the New York cops, I think it's a little bit of a problematic inference from those facts, but it's true that New York City is down, and it's down a lot. Chicago is down a lot. Just to give you a visual on that, the red line is the total decline in murder victims. The green line is African Americans. You can see from about 750 to just over 300. We're talking about huge drops in the violence rates in cities that have taken place. Sometimes it's hard to believe these. In fact, some people don't believe it, but teen pregnancy, right, despite the world is going to hell in a handbasket, teen pregnancies are down. I didn't put up here because it just came out a couple weeks ago. Abortion rates are down. Consider that. Arrests are down. And you can't see this, but if you look at racial differences, black blacks are doing better than whites in these statistics. Teen pregnancies are down over a third among black teens, 29% for whites. Life expectancy is up 6.6 years for black males, 3.7 years for white males. And demographers are into this, and part of this is due to the decline in violence. So we're seeing a demographic population shift. This is all good news, I think. So we're not used to getting good news. And suburban poverty, on the other hand, is up. And so cities are changing, and there's a hypothesis about sort of the great inversion and about poverty moving outwards. And then, of course, we've had the Great Recession, which has just hit all of this. And this is a paper with Ann Owens, who's here, that we looked at the differences over time. That is to say, taking into account pre-recession and post-recession to see it to the extent to which a national event like the Great Recession actually has consequences or manifestations for inequality at the neighborhood level. And you can imagine in your mind that if the recession had no sort of inequality generating effects, right, so everyone takes a hit, you would basically get, if you look at a regression line, this is the unemployment rate, 2005 to 7 before the recession. This is 2009 to 2011. These are PUMA data. I won't get into the statistical units here. Public use micro sample areas, they're larger than neighborhoods, but it's all we had pre-post recession. But this is the entire United States. This is not Chicago again, all the United States. And what you can see when you do that regression, and it's not that far in terms of prediction outwards in time, is you see these above the regression line. That's an inequality generating effect. That is to say, the higher the unemployment rate, the more the unemployment rate went up, as opposed to everyone getting an equal hit. So in other words, the inequality was not equally shared. That's the way to think about it in the recession, at the neighborhood level. Sort of the rich get rich, the poor get poor. This actually can be shown to be true at the neighborhood level as a function of the Great Recession. So what's interesting is you have all these phenomena going on, and then you have the recession, which is so reshuffling is not quite the way to think about it. It's more like it's imposing and sharpening that residential stratification and inequality that we know already exists. Furthermore, in terms of change, is public housing. And this is big in Chicago, and that's why I wanted to show you the picture. It's actually a photo from the book that I took. And it was meaningful for me because on this block is where, literally, it's a shadow, former shadow of the Robert Taylor homes, as I called it. If you kind of look north here, and also you can't look south, but this is looking north. These are the skyscrapers in the loop. These were high-rise public projects of the Robert Taylor homes, which were torn down, blown up by the CHA and the government. 30,000 people lived in this area, teeming with people. And literally, I remember going in these areas, and we did some interviews with families. And the juxtaposition is quite remarkable because despite the problems, it was a very dense, teeming environment. And this was true of other public housing projects. By the way, for those interested, and I show this to my students, it's quite a moving documentary by Frederick Wiseman, Public Housing. For those of you who want to see it, Henry Horner and other, which was done when the city had announced that they were going to start moving people out, but before. And it's just a typical Wiseman documentary. He just lets the cameras roll. And it's about 3 hours. It's long, but it's very profound, I think. And it's not so much Robert Taylor homes, but it's similar in terms of down on Pershing and Henry Horner and others. The point is, where did 30,000 people go? Think about it that way. The city actually can't really tell us, but we do know that the juxtaposition and public housing and mixed income housing is a key public policy issue today, and one that we're studying. And so there's 3 projects right now I'll just quickly mention and then open it up. Sort of 3 angles, I guess, projects addressing these social transformations in one way or another. The first, and I'll just mention it, has to do with this idea of observation and also gentrification, because gentrification is such an interesting phenomenon. And what's going on with gentrification? How do we measure it? Part of the argument that I've made, in particular, this is a paper in collaboration with Jackie Huang, a PhD student, that's also doing your dissertation on this, to kind of extend beyond what we were doing in the SSO using Google Street View, which this is just a shot. You can see a lot with Google Street View. I mean, you can stop it, of course. You can zoom in, zoom out. I mean, actual names of places, whether it's boarded up and so forth. You can really tell a lot, but it seems like the observational research has been used mainly for, again, the negative stuff. But you can also observe, quote, gentrifying things, like where new courtesies, public courtesies are being put in, where there's new windows, copper, plumbing, siding. And if you select, which we did, on disinvested neighborhoods, that is to say, we define gentrification as the process of renewal, upgrading, and in-migration within formerly disinvested neighborhoods. What we did is to capitalize on a study by some geographers, Wiley and Hamill, in 1995, who did a gentrification survey in Chicago and some other cities, and are able to look at the trajectory of gentrification by updating it with Google Street View to see where those neighborhoods are today. That is, ones that were at risk of gentrification, that were formerly disinvested, or if they had started gentrification, how far along the trajectory. We developed conceptual typology, and a paper coming out in the American Sociological Review. Bottom line is that the racial stratification, which we see for the other phenomenon, is manifested in gentrification as well. And Latino and African American neighborhoods do not see the same pathway of gentrification as do white neighborhoods, conditional even on disinvestment. So that's something that's coming along. Secondly, and yes, here's LA. So there's good reason for me to be here. I was telling Richard this. This is a new project, collaboration, in part with Robert Mayer up the road a bit at UCLA. And one of the things that we're interested in, that's why I showed you the picture of the empty field. A huge debate now in policy is about mixed income housing and public housing, place-based interventions. Maybe we can talk about this some. In other words, what do we do? Do we give people vouchers to move anywhere? Do we create mixed income units where you have market rental units and then subsidized units? Do you create new public housing? This is a question that's really out there. And then you have place-based interventions like Promise Zones neighborhood of the Obama administration, which are trying to revitalize poor neighborhoods. So what we decided was that one way to get some leverage on this was to take advantage of the data that we had collected in Chicago, which I've told you a little bit about, but also in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Family and Neighborhood Study, for those of you who know about that. Started by Rand in 1997, and it turns out that that study was built in part on the PHDCN Chicago project. We consulted with them, and many of the questions are the same. Their design is similar. It's a neighborhood stratified sample. So in other words, there's a lot of similarities. It started a few years later, and they have 2 waves. We had 3. And so we put together a proposal, and the MacArthur Foundation funded it. And it's, the acronym for short is Mixed Income Project, and it's an integrated longitudinal study of our families and kids and the LA fans. And one of the questions that we're seeking to examine is, over a long period of time through this new follow-up, the movement of people in and out of different kinds of housing environments. And we've just completed the study. The last interview was done in 2013, in I think May 2000. So we're still, in the cleaning and the grunt aspect of data analysis, which is never too fun. But we're starting to actually be able to do some fun analysis. Real briefly, we followed 1,072 of the Chicago kids, both from the birth cohort and the older cohort. So basically what we're getting is the adolescents in their transition to young adulthood. They're about 30, up to 32 now. And the birth, literally infants at birth up to adolescents. In LA, about 1,000 participants recruited early stages there. So the longitudinal picture now is 17 years, and this is pretty unusual. The PSID gives us longitudinal data, but the advantage, I think, of these more sort of contextual studies is that they're rooted in a particular city and a history and an ecology where you can build in this information on the communities and a rich measurement. So for example, when you think about choice and selection of neighborhoods, I mean, we literally have measured IQ for those who have the hypothesis that that's really what's behind some of these selection factors. We have a deep set of factors that we can actually look at that others can't. And we have the longitudinal piece connected to the contextual. And one of the things we're looking at, and this is preliminary, basically doing, it's like on the plane kinds of graphs, but it relates to the idea of inequality and durable inequality. I just want to give you a feel for what's happening, because I think I'm not sure what the final story is going to be, but these are trajectories now at the individual level. And here, so sort of flip it around, the outcome is the neighborhood attainment. That is to say, what neighborhood were you living in terms of poverty in 1995? And this is the 9-year-old cohort. So this is a transition to young adulthood. So think about it as you're 9-year-old, you're in your parents' home and neighborhood, the neighborhood they chose, quote unquote. The green line represents African Americans, 24% poverty rate on average, right? I mean, there's going to be a variability around this. This is the average. Latino Americans lower, about 20%, and whites about 18%. Now, these are not the absolute differences, because what I'm interested in doing here, at least an initial look, is to say conditional on their baseline characteristics. So, parental poverty, education, the violence rate of the neighborhood. In other words, if I were just to show you the raw difference between blacks and whites, it's going to be much different. But if I'm interested in explaining the change over time, I want to say something about how are African Americans, Latinos, and whites faring through the Great Recession, through time, in neighborhood context, conditioning on where they started out, right? Everyone sort of get that. It's just a basic point is let's condition on their baseline and see going forward what their trajectories look like. And what you can see is that there's a pretty stable pathway, a little bit of a decline, and this should be, right? Because we know that in the 90s poverty went down a bit. So if it was shooting up, then there'd be something wrong with the data. And we do see a slight decline going down, conditional again on baseline characteristics, although a widening of the gap, So now it's about, you see whites are improving more relative to blacks. So all of a sudden you start to see kind of a fanning out change. But then, and this is what's interesting, this is through the original 3 waves. And now this is 2012, where we're at today, and that's what it looks like. Post-recession, the increases, decreases more for whites, so the conditioned poverty rate now is under 14% over about 26%. So you can see this sort of decline and then differential trajectory. And that is somewhat disturbing and something that needs to be examined. So what this analysis is going to do is really to try to unravel the individual and neighborhood level differences. What kinds of neighborhoods are people exposed to? Mixed income, racial integration. What are the effects of how is the Great Recession manifested? And by the way, we have all the individual data. Did you live in a home that was foreclosed upon? Were you laid off? Educational attainment. So in other words, we know a lot about the individual characteristics. I haven't shown any of that here because we're just, as I said, cleaning the data. So give us a little time. That's what this year is all about. Finally, and I'm going to keep to the close to the hour. I want to say a little bit about another project. Keeping busy on the East Coast, and that's what winter is good for. That's right. What else can you do but work? So this is a new project funded by the National Science Foundation. It's called the Boston Area Research Initiative, and this is taking on the so-called big data. You've heard of this, right? Everything big data. I think it's been overhyped, that's my feel. But I'm open-minded, and we're trying to take it into account and say, what can we learn from this? Catalyzing a cross-disciplinary, cross-university urban research agenda. And I'm actually quite excited about it because there are really new forms of data coming on. I'm not going to try. If this was hooked up to the internet, I would be able to show you a movie. And the movie would go something like this. These are hundreds of thousands of digital records that are coming into the city that we got access through because Menino, despite the fact that he's was an old-time mayor, hired a bunch of nerdy, young, geeky Silicon Valley types to run what he called the Office of New Urban Mechanics because he knew he needed to find out what was going on. I think of it as Jane Jacobs meets big data. Housing, code enforcement. Think about this in terms of things we would like to know about neighborhoods. Building inspections, environmental services, requests, tree maintenance, graffiti, sanitation, highways, street lights, recycling, street cleaning, on and on and on. 150 case types. People can even go in on their app now. I've tried this. It's kind of cool. You can, there's a pothole, there's graffiti, there's a code ID. It's anonymous, but you know if it's the same person. Multiply reporting, you know where they're reporting. It's geocoded to time and space. So these are real-time data, actually. And they're streaming in. There's hundreds of thousands of records. And if I were to show you the movie, you can see it lighting up so you can know when and where it's occurring. As I said, well, they call this the constituent relationship management system. That's another whole theory. It's the idea that citizens are sort of constituents and should be part of governance. And the 911 system, by the way, it's just that's the old traditional, call for an emergency, robberies, and so forth. We have about over a million records for that. 550 case types. So what do you do with all this data? Well, first of all, despite the hype, and the editor of Wired magazine who said, well, with big data we don't need theory, right? Because the data will just tell us everything. But you do need some theory and you need some methods. Because what do these data mean? We don't know what they mean. They're emitting data. We need to structure them. So going back now to one of the themes I presented earlier, econometrics, we think can be applied here. And with Dan O'Brien, a postdoc on this project, and Chris Winship, sociologist, we've written a paper called Econometrics for Big Data. And the idea is to see what these big data can do for us. And we've applied it first off to broken windows theory. Then we've done disorder. We've done a few other things. And I can show you just quickly, pictorial visualization really, the kinds of things that can be picked up. And using structural equation models and econometric methods that determine the reliability, which we know, we've determined right down to like how many months of data do you need, stream of data. Do you need to go a year, 6 months, a week? What's the reliability, the validity through factor analysis? This has been reported in our paper, which is available if people would like a copy of it. This is an example of a factor we call public denigration. It's really more about the physical spaces where graffiti removal and improper storage of trash, illegal dumping and so forth is taking place, which forms a pretty tight structure. Another one is more private neglect, which I think has been overlooked. This is more big buildings and landlord kind of rodent infestations that people are complaining about, maintenance complaints, poor conditions of properties, landlords not keeping up, trucks parked illegally, illegal rooming house, and so forth, which is a different dimension than the graffiti removal. But we also have the classical interpersonal violence that one can get through the 911. Medical emergencies, too. Remember the CPR data I told you about? We now have fine-tuned data that we can get on emergencies, medical emergencies, and we can put this all together. Now, I think I'm going to skip over this. This is a complicated analysis, another paper that we've been working on that tries to look at the social disorder thesis over time and the extent to which public denigration or public disorder is related to violence using the sequential longitudinal data. It's based on a structural equation model over time. And again, this is another paper in progress, but the bottom line suggests that the public cues of disorder, sort of those graffiti indicators, are not actually or necessarily linked to violence. What we seem to see is this sort of reciprocal relationship where areas that have lots of violence sort of tend to unravel and generate more public disorder, that is drinking in the public and so forth, and then people tend to carry more guns, and there's more private conflict, and there's more homicide in those places. So you can almost think of this as a sense in which the disorder is a symptom of a larger kind of violent understructure, or cities that have, I'm sorry, not cities, neighborhoods that have unraveled, and we've done more longitudinal analysis to back that up. But I think what I'd like you to take away here is the idea that this really does allow us a fine-grained picture. It's like a microscope, right? It's just a new way to look at the city. That's what I would argue about these kinds of data. So for example, let me show you 3 shots. One is the aerial level, the city. This is now our measure of private neglect or disorder at the building level, which seems to be very predictive of a number of things, and the mapping of, for example, medical emergencies. Then you can go down, drill down to, let's say, a particular block. This is the same factor now, shaded by blocks. You can actually see block level where emergencies are occurring, or robberies, or graffiti, or whatever. This is just an example. And then penetrate down at another level, at the street level, at the address level. So we've now just linked each unit to historical records so that one can, for example, determine the code enforcement, the history of a particular place. So you've got place level dynamics, and you've got neighborhood level dynamics, and you can go back and forth. It's not easy, but there's a structure to this, and we're trying to develop a methodology to be able to analyze these kinds of data. And I think there's a lot of promise. So I'm going to conclude with that and just note a couple implications that come out of the book and this new work. And particularly if one is interested in policy, I guess I'm not going to propose any specific policies. That's not really what I do or study, but I think the message is that there's a lot of structure. It's overlying all these relationships, and it's something that Pat Sharkey at NYU, who's also written on neighborhood work, is argued, is that we need durable policies to counteract durable inequality, right? I mean, it's just sort of an obvious point, but it's something that's not really been, I think, well understood in terms of a lot of the one-shot examples. So I think that some of the promise zones interventions are important, and a number of us are trying to help advise on that. And I think the problem there is there's just not enough money and or will to carry out those kinds of interventions. And then there's the debate about the place-based versus person-based. There's others that say, well, just give it to the people, and we can have a debate about that. I have an opinion on that. Second is the salience of what I would say are cultural and social mechanisms, right? Collective efficacy, perceptions of disorder. Another thing I didn't even talk about, legal and moral cynicism, which plays a role in the book. Thirdly, the pivotal role of organizations and network structures. I showed you some of the network structures. What I didn't tell you about is how the density of nonprofit organizations makes a difference on a number of dimensions in the book. I'm not a neighborhood, internal neighborhood is all that matters. This isn't the world that we think existed, although I'm not really sure it ever did, where everyone knows their neighbors. You don't need that world, and moreover, it goes well beyond it. There's the spatial dynamics that are important here, and the higher order structures, which I've showed you, and the migration patterns that matter. And then finally, just as a way to bring new data into it, I think the big data and urban informatics revolution is here, and social scientists might as well try to harness it rather than ignore it, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. And hopefully help in governance. And I'll just conclude by saying that one of the things that the BARI initiative, Boston Area Research Initiative, has done is to convene and continues to convene meetings with the city. We work with the city, and the idea is to reimagine the city-university connection, which was actually the name of a conference that we held that launched the unit. So that's an overview, and I think I'll stop there and put it open for questions. Sure.
This powerful correlation between collective or negative correlation between collective efficacy and violence.
Right.
And yet we know, as you also showed, violence has been declining at a remarkably rapid rate. And I'm not a sociologist, but sociologists tell me that collective efficacy is actually falling across time. People don't know their neighbors as well, and so on. I mean, does that mean that it's wrong that collective efficacy has been falling over time, or that there's something about time series that's different than cross-section, or what?
So, great question. I think I would generalize your question to a lot of things, right? So we know that, for example, inequality is going up, and there's lots of secular changes that are going on, yet violence is going down. It's going down in a lot of places. So I think they're not necessarily the same, right? That is, the cross-sectional relationships are not necessarily being paralleled. It really raises the question of why is the violence rate going down in large part? And the honest answer is we don't know. Criminologists are debating this. There's a National Academy of Sciences working panel. People are arguing left and right about this, and policing, incarceration. There's all kinds of hypotheses. So I think there's something that is basically non-neighborhood related about the decline in violence, right? That's sort of separate from collective efficacy or anything else going on at the neighborhood level. About declines in collective efficacy, I'm not sure about that because it's a little tricky. I mean, it depends on how you measure it, and we don't really have good sort of a thermometer, if you will, to really tell those changes. And also, as I mentioned, I don't view it as strictly an indicator of sort of close-knit ties with one's neighbors, because you're right. I mean, people don't have those kinds of relationships much anymore. I don't. Let's face it, a lot of people don't want to. But you do want to, at least I would argue, most people do want to trust their neighbors and have a certain sense of cognitive or shared trust. And a lot of it is mediated through organizations, local organizations. And you see this I saw this in my own neighborhood, for example, where people aren't really talking, but if there's an issue that comes up, like let's say the school wants to add an addition or something like that, or reduce the number of teachers, then all of a sudden there's just an incredible collective response, or maybe not, variations in that. And so that's really the kind of thing that we're trying to tap, and I think there are real differences across communities. Whether that is going down over time, I'm not sure we know that. We do know that trust, particularly trust in institutions, bigger institutions, is going down. But whether that translates into the more localized trust, I'm not sure. But it's a really good question. I think the overall really interesting question, though, is this decline and what's accounting for it?
I remember hearing someone talk once, and unfortunately nothing in this was attributed, so I don't know what the source was. She was a healthcare worker in a hospital in Baltimore, and she said she could tell when a neighborhood was coming apart because the STDs spiked. And that when she then went and looked at the police records, yes, domestic violence was going up. And she said then there was also a fall in the level of mentors that a child or a young adult would have access to that fell below either 4 people or 4%. Unfortunately, I don't remember the number. I was wondering if you've heard of this sort of effect and whether you are able to address this sort of micro level impact where the number of the social interaction between young adults and their peers.
Yeah, it's a good point, and I'm sort of generally familiar with that argument, not the specific study. I'd say a couple things. One, I think, like, for example, the STD is sort of a leading indicator, maybe is the way to think about it, sort of a signal that things are unraveling in a neighborhood. One of the advantages of the kinds of data sources that we're now getting is I think we have a quicker way to pick up on those sorts of things, right, as opposed to finding out years later. So very sort of real-time indicator of that. The mentoring thing, there's various programs, including in Boston, the ceasefire program that was at least argued to have been part of helping to stem the youth violence problem in Boston, had as part of its structure a kind of a mentoring program. And that was where the ministers and the police got together and were attempting to really reclaim the youth and instituting a kind of a mentorship program. Now, what kinds of studies exist that are able to document those kinds of effects is another question. We don't, or we haven't really measured that in our study at all. The thing that comes closest is what we've called intergenerational closure, which is the extent to which adults in the neighborhood have knowledge of and know the names of, let's say, kids in the neighborhood, watch out for them. That's kind of a classic concept, comes out of James Coleman's work on social capital, where you have this sort of intergenerational ties, where the adults are kind of tied in, as opposed to not knowing who the friends of their children are, for example, or not having any sense of other kids in the community. That, in a way, is a generalized mentorship type of system. It's not a formal program.
Well, I'm sorry, when she said mentor, she was actually talking about role models. So
Yeah.
it's actually much more about what you're talking about.
Well, so then that would, well, that also goes to Bill Wilson's argument about what was behind the changes in communities with regard to the outmigration of the black middle class. Part of his argument was that you had a certain kind of role modeling, intergenerational closure thing that shifted over time. So to the extent that it's more general, yeah, I think there are some measures of this, and that's built into I would see it as kind of a variant of, and we can argue about labels, social capital, collective efficacy, and there's been a lot of ink spilled about this that's probably not worth getting into now, but I think they're tapping into a similar kind of dimension, so it's a good point.
I feel like you are offering, at least to me in the social service sector, a really breakthrough tool of lifting up this collective efficacy and defining it in a broader way than what we thought it meant. And I just want to know, am I misinterpreting your position with it? I didn't feel it was as emphasized in your presentation, but to me, every time we see where there are low social or high social problems, we say basically those are poverty maps. And your conclusion seems to say, yes, it has a lot to do with poverty, but there is another tool you may have access to. You might not be able to change the poverty rate, but you have the capacity to influence how people perceive their neighborhood, break out of their historical views, develop trust in others. And I think it's like one of the only answers that we have in a world where there's limited funding. We just can't put in all these dollars and changes all these things, but we can maybe influence this other. But I just wondered, do you still feel like, yes, that really is one that you ought to go after more and try to lift up and see if you can move collective efficacy? Yeah, but I'm looking to you and those in the field to do that. In other words, I'm a social scientist, so I would say that analytically, I would agree that I think there are two things going on here. And I didn't emphasize it maybe as much today because I'm trying to give the arc of the entire project, and I wouldn't want it to be defined as just that, because there's a lot going on in terms of what I think are important about neighborhoods. But you're right, and that links, though, to a theoretical point I made about the social mechanisms, the interactions, the cohesion, and the control. Remember, I said two key dimensions, that and the econometrics. That's consistent with what you're saying, which is the social
character, structure of relations is crucially important, and it's not the same thing as composition of the population. I mean, that is an analytic argument. I think it's justified. I think the data support it. It's not to say that you can ignore one or the other, and what I don't think is useful sometimes is that there's a, goes back to the, well, or even sometimes blaming the victim. You're saying, well, if it's poverty, then, why focus on collective efficacy? That's not what I'm saying. I mean, there's different ways you can think about this, but you can even look at it in the sense of among more well-to-do, or even in suburban areas, for example, you see variations in collective efficacy. So it's not just redundant with poverty. So I think that's an accurate read. But the question is, what sorts of policies can one construct to improve the nature of social ties and relationships? And that's a big question, and one that people are grappling with. That's where I say that's your job. And I don't mean that to be glib. I mean it in a fundamental sense, is that it's our job to provide the information. But I think there's, in terms of policing, schools, and by the way, the police are very interested in this. There's actually the Police Executive Research Forum, which was a meeting of police and researchers at Harvard. There's actually a hunger, as far as I can understand it, among police officers for how the police can actually be more positive in developing better ties with youth in the community, especially with all the stop and frisk discussion in New York, and a way as thinking of institutions as promoting collective efficacy. So I think there's actually a number of things going on, organizations. So I'm all ears to that. So I think yours is an accurate read. I just think it needs to be framed appropriately when it comes to the analytics. Yes?
I'm going to follow up on that.
Yeah?
Mortencia Amaro, here in preventive medicine and social work, and recently relocated from Boston.
Uh-huh.
I just wanted to follow up a bit on that, based on everything you have learned, and especially your work on mechanisms underlying some of the dynamics that you're observing. I think what would be useful is to have your thoughts on what may be some levers that are amenable to change, key levers that people who work on interventions, or whether they're at the policy level or at other types, should really think about. What are those potential points or levers that could be amenable to change based on all of your work? If you could give your thoughts on that, that would be helpful.
Yeah. Well, in a way, it is a good follow-on to that question, and I might give the same answer, which is, I don't know the exact best levers. Well, there's also the reality that you can have a phenomenon, and this is true in a lot of things in science, but where you can identify a mechanism, but you don't know how actually to intervene to change the ongoing structures because of the dynamics. I do think that at the structural level, there's a lot of action now, and I'm not sure what the right change is, but housing is certainly one. And I'm not sure that it's being done right, but it's certainly being done. So, the mixed income, the market rate, you see what's going on in New York with de Blasio. I'm in New York this semester. It's fascinating. And there was a big fight. He held up a huge development in Brooklyn unless the developer changed. He refused to change the zoning rules unless there were more low-income housing units that were put in a particular unit. Now, that's a change. So that's going to mean less income segregation, at least over the long run. Now, we don't know what the results of that are going to be, but we'll see. And it could also lead to more racial integration. So those are kind of policy, zoning, housing. When it comes to the more social interactional mechanisms, I think those are more, those are hard. Those are more byproducts of everyday dynamics that government has a hard time, I think, actually intervening in. But nonprofits and others, I think, do, and that's why I think some of these, particularly youth-oriented programs, whether it's the mentorship program, intergenerational programs, have possibility, and things that really yet have to be devised with regard to restoring trust, particularly in communities that have been heavily policed and where there's been high crime. There's still increasing or legacies of mistrust and distrust. And the New York City Police right now, I mean, that's one of their main targets. That's what they're trying to figure out how to actually resolve. And I think the kind of research that we do, I think, is very valuable in that, in terms of trust, cynicism, and how to build collective efficacy, or at least to measure it. That's the one thing I would say. Is that the one thing you can do is actually at least build a system for knowing what you're dealing with. Yeah, there was one over there.
In one of your slides, you talked about the presence of nonprofits and just together. What has the research shown you, if anything, major universities, which are nonprofits, University of Chicago, here at USC, that are located in communities with some of these kind of characteristics? What's their role? Because everybody now has an Office of Civic Engagement and trying to figure out how to get connected with the community. What's your research telling you about the effects of that?
Yeah, well, there I'm pretty optimistic, because if you look at, I don't know USC, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but if you look at Penn, Columbia, Yale, Boston, University of Chicago, or Harvard, a lot of these communities, although Harvard is not in a high poverty neighborhood, nonetheless, all of them had a kind of moat philosophy, right? It was just, we are university and everything else was just out there. And Chicago was, I was there for 12 years and actually chaired the campus committee on safety, and it was pretty awful because there was a patrol line. I mean, the largest police force in the state after Chicago was University of Chicago Police, and there was a border, and it was very clear that the university basically had nothing to do with the rest of the South Side, and there was historical legacies, fights with Woodlawn, and so on and so forth. New Haven, same thing. Penn and the west side of Philly. I mean, all of these places have changed. I mean, we can get into why. Is it, did they all of a sudden become wise? Were they forced to, and so on and so forth. But just some examples. The University of Chicago Police Department now patrols lower income neighborhoods that aren't part of the university. They give grants, Woodlawn, housing. There's new housing being built in what was formerly, no man's land. Penn, same thing. New Haven, much improved relationships, housing, investments. In other words, investments in the infrastructure of the communities that aren't just part of the community, under the theory that we're part of this larger community. Urban Health Initiative, University of Chicago. Harvard even, which was, buying up land secretly, now is providing, in terms of housing and so forth, in Alston and other places. So I actually think it's good news in the sense that there's no longer a sense that you can have an isolated unit, that you are part of this larger community and you damn well better understand it and interact with it. So if USC is anything like these other universities, then they're reaching out and providing resources to the surrounding community. Maybe that's not true.
Well, Rob, thank you for an excellent talk. You've given us a lot to contemplate. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you.